Freddie Gray's death in 2015, violent crime has spiked to levels unseen for a quarter-century. Inside the crackup of an American city. On April 27, 2015, Shantae Guy was driving her 13-year-old son home across Baltimore from a doctor's appointment when something, a rock, a brick, she wasn't sure what, hit her car. Her phone was turned off, so she had not realized that protests and violence had broken out in the city that afternoon, following the funeral of Freddie Gray, the 25-year-old man who drew national attention 8 days earlier when he died after suffering injuries in police custody. As she saw what was happening, fires being set, young people and police officers converging on the nearby vortex of the disorder, she pushed her son, Brandon, down in his seat and sped home. "Mom, are we home yet?" Brandon asked when they pulled up at their house just inside the city line, where they lived with Guy's husband, her grown daughter and her husband's late teenage son, brother and sister-in-law. "Yeah," she told him, "you're still holding my head down," he said. Guy grew up in an impoverished, highly segregated part of West Baltimore near what was now the focal point of the street clashes, but she had long since climbed into a different stratum of the city's society. She was working as an information technology project manager for T. Rowe Price, the Baltimore-based mutual fund giant. Seeing her old neighborhood erupt changed her life. After long discussions with her husband, who manages the office of a local trucking company, she quit her job and went to work for a community mediation organization. "It just felt like it was the work I was supposed to be doing," she said. In Baltimore, you can tell a lot about the politics of the person you're talking with by the word he or she uses to describe the events of April 27, 2015. Some people, and most media outlets, call them the riots, some the unrest. Guy was among those who always referred to them as the uprising, a word that connoted something justifiable and positive, the first step, however tumultuous, toward a freer and fairer city. Policing in Baltimore, Guy and many other residents believed, was broken, with officers serving as an occupying army in enemy territory, harassing African American residents without cause, breeding distrust and hostility. In 2016, the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division concurred, releasing a report accusing the city's police department of racial discrimination and excessive force. The city agreed to a consent decree with the federal government, a set of policing reforms that would be enforced by a federal judge. When an independent monitoring team was selected to oversee the decree, Guy was hired as its community liaison. This was where she wanted to be, at the forefront of the effort to make her city a better place. Read Alec McGillis's investigative article on Jared Kushner's apartment complexes in the Baltimore area, but in the years that followed, Baltimore, by most standards, became a worse place. In 2017, it recorded 342 murders, its highest per capita rate ever, more than double Chicago's, far higher than any other city of 500,000 or more residents and, astonishingly, a larger absolute number of killings than in New York, a city 14 times as populous. Other elected officials, from the governor to the mayor to the state's attorney, struggled to respond to the rise in disorder, leaving residents with the unsettling feeling that there was no one in charge. With every passing year, it was getting harder to see what gains, exactly, were delivered by the uprising. One night last October, after Guy and her husband, Daaman, had gone to bed, Daaman's brother banged on the bedroom door. "Yo, get up," he shouted. It was around 11:30 p.m. Daaman's 21-year-old son, Daaman Jr., whom Shantae had helped raise, would ordinarily have been home by then, after his bus ride across town from his evening shift working as a supply coordinator at Johns Hopkins Hospital. But he was nowhere to be seen. Daaman Sr. rushed to the door and asked what was going on. "Dame's been shot," his brother said. 4 months later, I met Guy and Daaman Jr. at a cafe near my office in the center of the city. Daaman had recently been released after spending 47 days in the hospital, with 20 surgical procedures. His inferior vena cava, which carries blood from the lower body to the heart, no longer functioned, he had to rely on collateral veins instead. He was trying to go back to work, but swelling in his legs and shortness of breath were making it hard. Daaman told me he had no idea who was behind the shooting, which he surmised was either an attempted robbery or a gang initiation. "It was unnerving," he said, knowing the shooter was still out there somewhere. "I don't like it when cars slow down to me or people are staring at me too long at stop signs," he said. Any one of y'all could be that person. You never know. But Guy, somehow, had come through the experience even more committed to the cause she had signed on for. Our city needs restoration, she told me. It takes remarkable fortitude to remain an optimist about Baltimore today. I have lived in the city for 11 of the past 18 years, and for the last few I have struggled to describe its unraveling to friends and colleagues elsewhere. If you live in, say, New York or Boston, you are familiar with a certain story of urban America. Several decades ago, disorder and dysfunction were common across American cities. Then came the Great Urban Rebirth, a wave of reinvestment coupled with a plunge in crime rates that has left many major cities to enjoy a sort of post-fear existence. Until 2015, Baltimore seemed to be enjoying its own, more modest version of this upswing. Though it is often lumped in with Rust Belt economic casualties like Cleveland, St. Louis and Detroit, Baltimore in fact fared better than these post-industrial peers. Because of the Johns Hopkins biomedical empire, the city's busy port and its proximity to Washington, Metro Baltimore enjoyed higher levels of wealth and income, including among its black population, than many former manufacturing hubs. The city still had its ills, its blight, suburban flight, segregation, drugs, racial inequality, concentrated poverty. But as recently as 2014, Baltimore's population, which is 63% African American, was increasing, up slightly to 623,000 after decades of decline. Office buildings downtown were being converted to apartments, and a new business and residential district was rising east of the Inner Harbor. The city was even attracting those ultimate imprimaturs of urban revival, a couple of food halls. The subsequent regression has been swift and demoralizing. Redevelopment continues in some parts of town, but nearly 4 years after Freddie Gray's death, the surge in crime has once again become the context of daily life in the city, as it was in the early 1990s. I have grown accustomed to scanning the briefs column in the Baltimore Sun in the morning for news of the latest homicides, to taking note of the location of the latest killings as I drive around town for my baseball coaching and volunteering obligations. In 2017, the church I attend started naming the victims of the violence at Sunday services and hanging a purple ribbon for each on a long cord outside. By year's end, the ribbons crowded for space, like shirts on a tenement clothesline. The violence and disorder have fed broader setbacks. Governor Larry Hogan canceled a $2.9 billion rail transit line for West Baltimore, defending the disinvestment in the troubled neighborhood partly by noting that the state had spent $14 million responding to the riots. Target closed its store in West Baltimore, a blow to a part of town short of retail options. The civic compact has so frayed that one acquaintance admitted to me recently that he had stopped waiting at red lights when driving late at night. Why should he argued, when he saw young men on dirt bikes flying through intersections while police officers sat in cruisers doing nothing? Explaining all this to people outside Baltimore is difficult, not only because the experience is alien to those even in cities just up or down the interstate from us, though a handful of cities elsewhere, like Chicago and St. Louis, have experienced their own waves of recent violence, albeit less dramatically than Baltimore. It's also because the national political discourse lacks a vocabulary for the city's ills. On right-wing talk radio, one of the few sectors of the media to take much interest in Baltimore's crime surge, there are old tropes of urban mayhem, Trump's American carnage, typically lacking from these schadenfreude-laced discussions is any sense of the historical forces and societal abandonment that the city has for decades struggled to overcome. On the left, in contrast, Baltimore's recent woes have been largely overlooked, partly because they present a challenge to those who start from the assumption that policing is inherently suspect. The national progressive story of Baltimore during this era of criminal justice reform has been the story of the police excesses that led to Gray's death and the uprising, not the surge of violence that has overtaken the city ever since. As a result, Baltimore has been left mostly on its own to contend with what has been happening, which has amounted to nothing less than a failure of order and governance the likes of which few American cities have seen in years. To understand how things in Baltimore have gotten so bad, you need to first understand how, not so long ago, they got better. Violence was epidemic in Baltimore in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as it was in many other cities, as crack intruded into a drug market long dominated by heroin. In 1993, the city crossed the 350 homicide mark. These were the years that inspired The Wire. They also gave rise to Martin O'Malley, a city councilman who was elected mayor on an anti-crime platform in 1999. O'Malley set about implementing what was then known as the New York model: zero tolerance for open-air drug markets, data-centric CompStat meetings to track crime and hold police commanders accountable, and more resources for law enforcement paired with tougher discipline for officers who abused their power. By the time O'Malley, a Democrat, was elected governor of Maryland in 2006, crime rates, including murders, had fallen across the board, but at a cost. Arrests had jumped to 101,000 in 2005 from 81,000 in 1999, leaving a city full of young men with criminal records and months and years away from jobs and families. This perturbed a police detective named Tony Barksdale. At the time a colonel in his mid-30s, Barksdale, a bald, bearish man with a lugubrious manner, grew up in a rough section of West Baltimore. "I saw my first guy get shot at a football tryout at Franklin Square, near his home," he told me when I met him for lunch last spring in the city's Canton neighborhood. His own block was relatively safe, however, because a police officer lived on it. Barksdale was drifting through Coppin State College, blowing Pell Grants, when he saw a bunch of young black cops on the street one day. The sight inspired him to sign up himself.